What do you want the world to know about you?
I'm a regular guy in college. I struggle with a lot of things, but I do my best to not let them affect me, and I think I can relate to a lot of people through what I've gone through.
Tell me about what you have gone through.
So, a few years ago, I was diagnosed with some mental health disorders. The ones I struggle with are major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and ADHD.
How would you break down each of your diagnoses and how it impacts you?
Okay. With major depressive disorder, depending on the period of my life or since I've been diagnosed, it's either been pretty deep sadness where it was hard to really get enjoyment out of anything or have much to look forward to, or a really profound sense of numbness where nothing really mattered and I couldn't make myself do anything really just because to me there was no point. I think the numbness was a lot more difficult to deal with just because even if you're sad, you at least have something to feel. It's sort of like a human emotion regardless of if it's good or bad. And so that at least gave me some sense of normalcy or humanity, but with numbness, there's not really anything going for you, not much going on. And so that's kind of how depression has affected me. With anxiety, it's infiltrated quite a few areas of my life. Obviously, I have social anxiety, so it's been historically difficult for me to talk to people, even about simple topics, much less something as complicated as the disorder itself.
In the email you sent about this interview, you mentioned how a lot of your anxious thoughts center around religion. Would you like to expand on that?
Oh, yeah, I definitely can. It just because religion was a huge part of my upbringing, even though it wasn't really at home. I spent so many hours at school every day, and Christianity was woven into every single one of our subjects. When we did art, we would look at certain cathedrals and the paintings and stained glass that they had. When we did history, some of my history classes were just biblical history, where every bit of the history came from the Bible. I think my depression and anxiety have affected me the most. Before it was OCD, but now the feelings of kind of loneliness or anhedonia, which is lack of enjoyment in certain things, especially hobbies, those have been probably the most debilitating, but I'm doing my best to move on with them. Oh man, I totally lost my train of thought.
Does that happen a lot?
Yeah, it's difficult to put these concepts into words. Everything we did had kind of this Christian undertone, maybe even an overtone, but I feel like they tried to let us not see it that way. And so it was just ingrained in me to believe that God existed, Christianity was true, and even controversial things like women shouldn't be in the military and homosexuality is wrong, which of course I very much flipped 180 degrees. I'm totally on the other side of those. But those were just so normal to me for so long. And so when I switched schools to one that was less classical, it was still Christian, but it was a lot more lenient and they encouraged us to think for ourselves. It was a huge culture shock, first of all. But it was the first time in my entire life that any of my core beliefs had been challenged. And since that was around the same time my anxiety sprung up, I just ended up spending a ridiculous number of hours thinking about all the different questions of, does God exist? If God exists, which God is the correct one? Which religion is true? Even if one of the texts is true, is our modern interpretation of it true? Even when I know rationally that so many people deal with anxiety and depression, even are worried about the same topics within those as I am, I sometimes feel like maybe the severity or the specific things that are bothering me aren't really understood by anyone else. And that used to be a much bigger problem, but even now it's extraordinarily difficult to deal with. I feel like there's no worse feeling than feeling like you're the only one in something. And even within the modern interpretations of Christianity, there are hundreds of sub-branches and different things, and all of them say they're right.
How old are you at this time?
I was 13 or 14.
And your worldview was collapsing?
Oh, it had already, it was down. It had just imploded super, super quickly.
I don't know why I'm smiling so much. Why am I smiling? I'm like here, like cool.
It's a crazy, interesting thing to be talking about.
Yeah,
so.
no, it is fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, regardless of what anybody's personal beliefs are, there's so many different worldviews.
Yes.
And when you realize that, oh my gosh, I might have picked the wrong option. What is that like?
I feel like the troubling realization I came to was that I didn't even pick an option. It was just the one that I had been given.
What's it like living with OCD?
With me, it really adds to my overthinking. I haven't experienced too many of the compulsions of like the compulsive portion of OCD, but definitely the obsessive thoughts. Once there's usually there's a certain topic or problem that enters my mind, and I usually don't get rid of it for around 6 months to a year, and then once that dies down, another one will inevitably pop up.
Can you give me an example of some of those intrusive thoughts?
The worst intrusive thought that it started around 4 years ago, and maybe even 5, and it's still with me, is all of the different questions related to worldview and sort of like existential crises. I don't know, if I would have been born in China, I would have been exposed to probably multiple worldviews. Probably not.
What's it like to know that your worldview was dependent on where you were born?
It is something that I wasn't able to, the anxiety behind it was present until I sort of departed from Christianity. I was never able to fully understand why God would let some people be put into a situation where they immediately know Him, and others where they would either have to work hard or even do things that were illegal to even know that He existed, like in areas where the Bible is banned, or if they're part of, let's say some remote tribe in the Amazon rainforest where there's no contact from non-tribal people. There's no chance for them to even know that God exists. To think that where you're born affects the worldview you have, even to the point where if God exists or doesn't exist, is really sad.
What are your main symptoms of anxiety?
I think the main one that still affects me is just the constant thinking. So, sort of in the way I present myself, it's kind of come out with my OCD, where one of the things I do is I always adjust my hair like this, regardless of if it looks good or bad. It usually doesn't even change the way it looks. It's just something I'm always thinking about, and so I always have to adjust it. Also, just trying to think of, like, in social environments, like, what words should I say? Should I use, like, hand gestures? Should I, like, smile more? It's kind of just something that's always not even in the back of your mind. It's kind of in the front of your mind, and it takes away from thinking or trying to think about anything else. The main difficulty I experience is I truly believe that the main problems I'm experiencing right now are real. I definitely can catch myself sometimes when I'm thinking irrationally and I'm wondering if things in the future aren't going to go well, or if I'll, lose everything, and I can't even predict what kind of bad things would happen. But most of the time I worry it's about real issues that are affecting me presently and will probably affect me for quite a while.
How old are you?
I'm 19.
So you were part of Gen Z that really grew up engulfed in social media.
Absolutely.
Do you think that contributed to your disorders at all?
Oh, I think without a doubt it contributed to my disorders. Probably, I could name some ways for sure, but probably in many, many ways that I wouldn't have even thought about. I mean, seeing the overly positive messaging, or I guess the overly positive posts on social media, not mental health related, but just people going out and doing things and making it look like their lives are totally perfect, even when they probably struggle in many similar ways.
Do you worry about things that are impacting the world?
Oh gosh, yes, I definitely do. I mean, every political or health issue that not even that receives like international attention, I feel like I sometimes fall into a pattern of seeking it out just and sort of rationalize it as learning more about the world, when in reality I'm just feeding into those bad behaviors. If I go back to the whole religious thing, one of the big things was being taught that I was innately not a good person. And so that is kind of combined with me seeing all of the terrible things going on social media and the lack of action that I can take. They combine to make it, they work against any productive thoughts on my self-worth, I think.
So from an early age, you had it ingrained in you that you weren't a good person?
Pretty much. I mean, my parents obviously always said otherwise because they weren't really strict Christians. They obviously said, you know, like, you guys are really great people. It's not even entirely just how we raised you. You guys have just made really good decisions and you're super empathetic. But that really went into competition with the whole idea that we're born sinful and there's nothing we can do other than getting our goodness from something else. And so even though I don't believe in that anymore, it's not really possible to get that mindset out in a short period of time, I think.
Anxiety is an interesting one because I know it can be so debilitating, but can it be hard for people who don't experience it to understand how severe it can be?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, before I had struggled with these disorders, I'd kind of had a stigmatized view of anxiety. I didn't really understand why people worried so much about certain things, and I thought, like, when it got to be too debilitating and it kept them from doing certain things like school and work, I didn't understand how something could become that severe. But now that I've been diagnosed, man, it can do quite a lot. I mean, infiltrating like all of the relationships I have, not just romantic, but just with everyone I interact with.
Do you have a roommate?
I have a few, yes.
So will you be ruminating and having these thoughts and anxious thoughts, and your roommates are around you and nobody knows, and you're just like, everything's wrong?
Yes. God, it's one of the worst feelings being around other people, especially people you're around so often, and having something that you don't know if you should bring up with them. So if I'm around my roommates, or obviously, especially if I'm in class, like a big lecture hall filled with students, it's not something I can really talk about. And when I can't talk about it and I am in a rough spot where I can't really leave or do much, the only thing I can do is ruminate. So it's a very, very helpless feeling when it's one of the few times I think where you would feel helpless and it's actually warranted, because there really, in reality, just isn't much you can do in that moment. I definitely have those moments where I feel super isolated and alone, even if I'm around other people. Actually, especially if I'm around other people, just because when I'm around certain people who don't appear to be struggling with the same things that I am, it kind of amplifies everything. It being around certain people at certain times reminds me of how unique my symptoms are or my situation is, even if that's not true. It's just having people who I would deem to be normal being around me it can be incredibly triggering.
So will people be socializing and maybe planning their weekends and everybody's happy and laughing and you're sitting there like, why do I exist?
I don't know if I would even be able to word it better than that. I mean, like, just specific moments at parties where I think I'll finally start getting into the groove of being there, because it's still a super unnatural feeling because I never really went to parties until college. And suddenly, even when I'm like, I don't drink or do anything like that, but even when those aren't affecting my mind, it just pops into my head. What am I doing? Why am I here? What is my whole purpose in my career?
What's it like to be diagnosed with ADHD?
I think, to be honest, ADHD is probably the one I think about and focus on the least, just because it's not that my ADHD is really mild or it's not something that causes any issues. It's just that it's something I've dealt with and been able to compensate for so long, especially with my academics, that it hasn't really been something that I needed to put much time into. And also with these other issues causing significant issues throughout the past like half decade or even more, I've needed to make space for those.
I know you've been watching our content for a while. What's it like to be in an interview?
It's a lot more natural than I thought it would be. Just now that I've been sitting here for a good while, I've adjusted. But I mean, even just seeing you in person, it's like it's hard to really comprehend. But it also isn't too unnatural, just because you're a pretty amiable person. It's not hard to talk to somebody like you. So
thank you.
Of course.
Do you think hearing other people share their stories on SBSK and just other platforms on the internet has allowed you to have the confidence to share yours?
Oh, it's probably been the biggest factor in that. I mean, if I didn't see other people doing it, I wouldn't have really even thought to do it. I mean, if no one else had done it, I guess there would have really been no way for me to know that things like this can be public. It used to be really, it was just instinctive to try to cover up and make it seem like I had everything together and school was going perfectly. But now that I know not everyone has it just like they make it seem like it is, I'm able to talk more about it and go into such deep, very usually emotional conversations like this.
When somebody finishes this interview, what do you hope they remember from it?
I don't really hope that they remember me. I feel like I'm just an average college kid. There's nothing too special about me. I just hope that some of the ideas that I've talked about can be implanted in some people's heads. Mainly that they're not alone and that there are things that can be done to help with the issues they're facing. If I'm able to deal with my issues and I guess find people to talk with, that I think pretty much everyone else can.